Superman gets a brand new power related to kryptonite, and God's wrath, the Spectre, shares a mix of meaningful and nonsensical sentiments with atheist superhero Mr. Terrific. Hi, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about DC Comics 1 week after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. In each installment, I pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, full spoilers for everything I talk about. That's your first and only warning. Catching up on 2 weeks of comics right now. First, we're going to look at comics originally released to the Ultra tier on July 16th, 2025, and originally published on June 18th, 2025. Starting with Superman Unlimited number 2. We had the tease at the end of issue 1 about some kind of change in Superman's powers, and now we kind of get the reveal of what that is. Basically, in a potential relationship to his previous new power from a few years back, the solar flare ability that he gained. Now, when he's exposed to kryptonite too much, or for too long a period of time, or at least they're saying this kryptonite that came in this giant asteroid to Earth. So maybe they're giving themselves an out that this won't be for all kryptonite. Going forward in comic books, they can always change it for whatever reason they want. But I thought that was interesting that they mentioned this green kryptonite. But anyway, once he's exposed to it for too long, at first it has the normal effects of weakening him and hurting and all that kind of stuff. And then there's like this overload point where he goes into, Super Saiyan mode, where he totally turns like gold, glowing yellow gold all over. And he is completely impervious for 200 seconds to kryptonite and has all of his full power back for those 200 seconds. But after that time has elapsed, not only is he vulnerable to kryptonite again, all of his power has been drained. He's just like a normal dude until he has a chance to recharge. And they haven't specified how long it would take him to recharge at this point, but that is kind of like the new status quo. I think it'll be interesting and certainly relevant in this storyline, in this kind of new status quo where kryptonite is so commonplace on Earth because of the asteroid. I'm wondering if eventually it'll kind of feel like a shark jumping thing. I mean, for Superman to forever have this out against kryptonite, I'm not sure how I feel about it. But for right now, it's a novel and interesting concept. That's Superman Unlimited number 2. Then we've got a couple of comics that were not working for me. The first would be Batman Superman World's Finest number 40. This is continuing Mark Waid's run writing this series, and I think a lot of what he's been doing has been a little bit whimsical, a little bit on the light side, drawing inspiration from the Silver Age, which that seems to be going on, of course, in the recent Superman movie. A number of people have observed, and I'm half wondering if there is a trend maybe in comic books right now among some writers to lighten things up, to make things more whimsical, a little less reasonable and logical in terms of world-building consistency, in favor of kind of going in this pseudo-1960s direction. The way it shows up in this issue is this giant kaiju-sized monster shows up, and Batman and Superman immediately need to spring into action, and Batman says, we got to stop by the cave, meaning the Bat Cave, really quick to get something I've been working on. Well, what's the thing he's been working on? It's a giant kaiju-sized mech that Batman can get in and pilot and go toe-to-toe with this giant kaiju monster. And just the ridiculous convenience of that is something he's just been working on in the Batcave. Feels a bit like the 1960s Batman, where just any gadget he wanted, he could pull out of his belt and be like, okay, now I've got some bat shark repellent, because that is what this exact situation would call for. And so it's just like, I'm not liking that vibe. And so at that point, I kind of checked out for a lot of the story. So anyway, I think I'm not skipping, I'm not like ending my reading of this series, but I'm definitely ready for a new writer or for Mark Waid to shift gears in terms of the tone of this book, because just a number of things about it have been a little too whimsical for me. So that's Batman Superman World's Finest number 40. Then we've got Wonder Woman number 22, and Tom King has been a little bit between his two big story arcs, one that he finished where they were going up against the Sovereign. That one outstayed its welcome for me, so we're getting a little bit of a breather, but he's about to start a whole new story arc. And this issue 22 is like a prelude to that in some way. It's got, I guess the new story arc is going to have some kind of theme of mice and men or something. I hope it doesn't carry on what we see in this issue, because in this issue, Wonder Woman is going up against a mouse-themed villain who's just ridiculous, wearing basically a leotard with a mouse-looking kind of mask on, and it's not working for me. And I guess he controls mice or mutates them to make them giant mice. She's fighting giant mice at Capitol Hill in this issue, and it's played very much for whimsy, and it goes into the territory of anthropomorphizing mice. Now, maybe we'll find out. It's unclear to me if the mouse villain in this thing, Mouse Man, I think his name might be Mouse Man. Anyway, it's unclear to me for sure if he has mental control over mice. But there's sometimes where he would be emphatically, or wait, was it another character? That a mouse would be echoing or paralleling what someone was doing, like hand gestures and everything. And I'm like, what is going on here? Mice do not use hand gestures. And so it's that sort of short-sighted humor that in the moment maybe gets a chuckle, but if you think it through, I'm like, okay, are we to understand now that animals in the DC universe are actually in some way intelligent, close, bordering on human intelligence? Wonder Woman in this issue actually talks to a mouse. She starts saying squeak, squeak, and having an exchange with a mouse, who in one panel is even actually gesturing with one of his front paws in a very human-like kind of vibe. And I don't like this device. I don't want Wonder Woman talking to animals. I don't know if that's a power she's had before and that's a new thing. I just don't like that. But the reason I typically don't like characters having a super ability to talk to animals is because at the same time, almost always, the writing style elevates the intelligence of the animal that's being spoken to, as though they are actually about as intelligent as humans, or at least half as intelligent as humans or something like that, with that kind of thought complexity. And the only reason that we don't notice it is because of a language barrier. But I mean, that is provably false. And so it just seems kind of silly to suddenly have animals have these more complex human-like thoughts and interchanges with people that can speak to animals, and it's weird. It's weird. Anyway, so I was not into the tone of Wonder Woman 22. I'm getting closer and closer to dropping this book. It's so crazy because Tom King's run, it started out very thought-provoking, very interesting, and I'm just not liking where it's been going lately. So yeah, Wonder Woman 22. Then we got Batman and Robin Year 1, number 8. Not much to say about this except that it's really been growing on me. And the fact that we're seeing more of the dynamic between Dick Grayson and Bruce Wayne, as he is, for the first time, because this is the first Robin, for the first time he's got a young boy in his life, and he's trying to figure out not just how to mold him and channel his passions and his energy and his sense of wanting to do something about the injustices of the world because of the tragic loss of his parents. I think that's a through line in at least the first two Robins, arguably maybe the first three. But he's also trying to figure out, okay, how do I in some sense be a dad to this boy that is suddenly in my charge? And so there's a neat exchange that he has briefly with Jim Gordon just on the subject of fatherhood. Also, the villain, or one of the villains in this storyline, has been Clayface. And I love Clayface as he was kind of recreated or envisioned in the 90s Batman animated series. And this Clayface seems very much based on that or continuing that through line. And given the fact that we have a greenlit Clayface movie that's going to be coming in the next, I don't know, couple of years, I can't remember. Clayface is on my mind. I suspect that's maybe part of the reason why he's being featured in this story, to kind of just get him into our minds more and more and have some synergy between the comics and what's happening in the world of film. But I like Clayface already. And so, yeah, Batman and Robin, year one, been growing on me, and that's certainly continuing to be true with issue 8. Let's see here. Batman in Detective Comics 1090. Is it 1098? I can't quite make that out. Yeah, 1098. So this has him interacting with the Penguin, who he's kind of forced to team up with as he's trying to rescue Harvey Bullock. In the last issue, he thought he was about to rescue him, and he stumbles instead upon the Penguin and kind of rescues the Penguin. Well, then the Penguin gets swept up into Batman's continuing endeavor to rescue Harvey Bullock, and is almost kind of inadvertently having to fight alongside Batman. Batman's having to keep him under control and say, hey, no killing. And so anytime you have characters of very different personalities, very different opposing views, and you force them to work together, I always enjoy that. It makes for good character-driven storytelling because it brings out the differences between the two characters. And so, yeah, I'm liking what's going on in Detective Comics 1098. And it looks like more of that will probably continue next time, but with adding Harvey Bullock into the mix to have another personality to play off of. All right, so that's all the comics from the first week. Now, looking at comics released on the Ultra Tier on July 23rd, 2025, and originally published June 24th, 2025. First, just briefly, I'll comment on New History of the DC Universe #1. This was a slog to read through, and I was kind of surprised and a little sad that it's not just a one-shot. There is at least going to be one more issue of this. I don't know how many. It says 1 of 4. Oh my gosh. So I don't know if I'm going to read any more of this. It basically, the conceit is that Barry Allen, now retired as the Flash, is sort of, I guess, making himself useful as the one who has probably done the most traveling between parallel realities and time resets and all that kind of stuff. He is taking the time to chronicle what is the history of the DC Universe as it is now. And I think the timing is pretty good for this. There's been enough soft reboots with the New 52 and then DC Universe Rebirth, and enough questions probably building up in some people's minds of, okay, what counts as continuity, what doesn't? I used to be a lot more interested in that than I am now. Now, I've been reading comics for so many years, I can't keep all the details in my head anyway, even if it was a single unaltered continuity. And so when writers fudge the details or just kind of, glaze over some things, I actually don't mind. I've come to interpret and accept comics as like, if I were to have a headcanon about like how true are they, I would think of it as like, well, they're all kind of legends being told from different perspectives that are largely getting the facts right, but there's a singular truth behind all of it that, like, who knows how well it's being represented in any of these things. And I just kind of shrug. I'm not all that worried about it. So that makes me all the less interested in slogging through more issues of this, because it's basically just a blow-by-blow of like, then this character came on the scene and was teamed up with this team, and they fought against this and this and this and this. It's just a lot of like names being listed. It's just a slightly enhanced way, I feel like, of giving a very dry rundown of who exists in the DC universe, who is part of continuity, just so you can have a reference point. But like, apart from a reference material, I did not find it enjoyable to read at all. So I will probably, just because I'm, I guess, that much of a glutton for punishment, I will probably read at least the second issue, just to satisfy my curiosity about some things related to continuity, but don't hold me to that. I could just as easily get 2 pages in issue 2 and say, nope, I'm bored, not worth it. But anyway, that's New History of the DC Universe #1. Let me get to The Flash #2. This one I started to read. It would be the first issue of The Flash I really tried to read at the beginning and give it a good try in a little while. But very soon I was like, nope, skimming again. This run by Simon Spurrier has just been emphasizing things about the Flash that are not about running and moving fast. It's dealing, just conceptually, this series is not really about the fantasy of super speed anymore. It's about all kinds of different things that super speed could potentially bring about, like alternate realities, copies of oneself. Copies of oneself is a big thing right now with Wally West. And the number of panels that I actually see Wally running and doing things at super speed is so dramatically reduced from what has been typical of this series, of the Flash, multiple Flash series in the past, in my experience. And so I'm just waiting for all this kind of like other conceptual stuff that the book is focused on and has been focused on for a while to just be done with. Can we get back to the fantasy of someone moving so fast that the world in comparison to them is moving in slow motion? I am ready. I'm ready to go back to just the basics of super speed. All right, so that's the Flash 22. Then we've got Green Lantern 24. Not much to say about this, except I'm continuing to enjoy what Jeremy Adams is doing in the relationship between Hal Jordan, Green Lantern, and Carol Ferris, the Star Sapphire. It definitely seems like it's going on the path that I was hoping it would at the very beginning, which is this ongoing, steady relationship between these two characters in which they are growing and maturing. They're learning more about each other. They're learning more about their differences and how to navigate conflict and different perspectives and points of view. There's so much richness to that in really a long-term relationship, and we see a little bit more of that here, which is nice. Also, we've got Kyle Rayner being heavily featured in kind of a parallel story running at the same time, and he's joined by other characters as well. But this issue establishes that he still is a White Lantern. I kind of liked the idea of him being special, because as soon as the Rebirth event happened that Jeff Johns did that brought Hal Jordan back and all that kind of stuff, there was a real danger, which really played out, of Kyle suddenly receding into the background. And I still wanted him to be special, to be unique, not just another Green Lantern, not just the torchbearer who was keeping things together while the Green Lantern Corps was disassembled. And I don't know that White Lantern Kyle Rayner was like the most super exciting thing for me, but I did like the idea of him being able to channel all the energies of the emotional spectrum, because as a creative type, as an artist, that makes a lot of sense that he would be really kind of connected to his feelings in the way that many other people are not. And so I think that's really fitting for Kyle, and I like that even though it doesn't look like necessarily he's going to go full on into being just White Lantern again, he does they do say he does still kind of have access to those abilities. And I like that. I like returning to that, and I hope that that gets developed in a way. Do I want to see him no longer be a Green Lantern? I don't know. I think you could... It just depends on if they tell a good story with Kyle. What he ends up as doesn't really matter to me, but I like the idea of him being special in the Green Lantern mythos, and so I hope we see more of that developed. So that's Green Lantern number 24. And then finally, the one I was probably most curious about was Mr. Terrific Year 1, number 2. Now, I am a big fan of the Spectre series by John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake from back in like the, I want to say, late 90s, early 2000s. And that is where Mr. Terrific, the Michael Holt version, which we saw recently in the Superman movie, first appeared, although that version of Michael Holt hadn't been developed yet. In the, was it like Spectre number 56 or something? I can't remember. You can find it on Wikipedia. But I revisited that. I skimmed through it to kind of see that story in comparison to how they were retelling this moment with the Spectre, because the Spectre was very much key to Michael Holt taking up the mantle of Mr. Terrific. Now, in that original issue, by the end of that issue, taking up the mantle of Mr. Terrific did not involve him having all the T-spheres, the sci-fi technology, the ability to be invisible to all technology. That seemed to have been all developed when he came into the JSA book that was written by David Goyer and Jeff Johns, and eventually just Jeff Johns. So it was that creative run that really made him into Mr. Terrific as we think of him and have thought of him for years in the comics, and as he appears in the recent Superman movie. But this kind of like prototypical version of Michael Holt, Mr. Terrific, that was just street level, just appeared in this one issue of the Spectre, I was wondering, is that gone? Especially since, and I don't remember for sure, I'd have to go back and look if that issue of the Spectre, if it was established that he was an atheist at that point. I'm thinking, but I could be wrong, that it was his atheism as a part of his personality and character was established sometime in the JSA run. But you can fact check me on that, I'm not sure. But it didn't seem to be leaned into that I remembered in that issue of the Spectre. And so, coming back to Mr. Terrific's origin, I was wondering, okay, how much of this are they going to honor that original origin story in the Spectre and also factor in his atheism, which really I didn't feel like was touched on hardly at all in the original issue of the Spectre. Again, I could be wrong. So what is this melding looking like? Do they honor the original story? Yes, they do, actually. I was surprised that there was actually bits of dialogue that were, I think, copied and pasted from that original issue. And the nature of the conversation, what Michael Holt and the Spectre were talking about, was very much consistent in many ways with the original issue. So I was very happy with what happened here. There was, though, an interesting exchange that was added that was unique to this telling of his origin story, where the Spectre first says something that I'm like, oh, well, if you think of it this way, that's really profound. But I don't know if the writer actually meant it that way. And then the second thing he said, which unfortunately he repeated, so it was even more emphasized, was something kind of philosophically nonsensical, or at least without logical grounding. So let's take a look at those. So Michael Holt is about to commit suicide, just distraught over the loss of his wife and unborn child. The Spectre confronts him on the bridge that he's about to jump off of. But Holt's reaction is, this isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real. The Spectre says, I assure you, I am as real as you are. I am God's wrath. And then he says, self-murder is still murder, and that is the province of the Spectre. And that's copied and pasted directly from the original issue of the Spectre. Now, it seems like, in some sense, a bit of a weak justification to bring the Spectre in, both because we think of suicide differently. It's much more of a tragic type of thing than like this outwardly hateful type of thing that murder is. And then also it's preemptive on the Spectre's part. So he's not actually responding to something that's happened. He's anticipating something. And so in the original issue of the Spectre, is this kind of a weak tether to bring the Spectre in? Maybe, unless you consider the value of human life. And I don't know if John Ostrander had that in mind, or if it was just kind of like a weak justification because he wanted to tell this story and have this exchange between Spectre and Holt. But for a moment, if we assume that there is some recognition of the value of human life, this really makes sense. And by value, I mean objective value of human life, not the value that one assigns to their own life, but the idea that every human life is created by God, and biblically, we would see made in the image of God, has been infused with tremendous purpose and value by God, because not only are we made in the image of God, but God became a human, kind of joined along with us in a way that's just mind-blowing, and then sacrificed his life in Jesus so that we could be in unbroken relationship with him forever. That assigns mind-boggling and baffling value to every human life. Value also, and significance and purpose that we do not generate for ourselves, but that is given to us, assigned to us by our Creator. And so we do not have the right, really, to say what our own purpose is, and we don't have the right to destroy our own lives because we have been made with a higher purpose in mind. And so we ought to be fulfilling that purpose, which would involve continuing to live and seeking to align ourselves with that purpose more and more. And that is the opposite of what Michael Holt is about to do in this moment. And so in that kind of framework of thinking, it makes sense that this would be considered by the Spectre and by God an evil for someone to do that to themselves. Now, unlike the Spectre, God is capable of having multiple thoughts, multiple, I guess we would say, emotions. We're getting into analogous language, so it gets difficult to kind of describe God at some point with these limited terms. But God, unlike the Spectre, is capable of having compassion for someone because of their really pitiable circumstances, such as those of Michael Holt right now, but also a fierceness and an anger at the wrong that person's about to do or thinking of doing or has done. That God, those things can coexist in God's perspective. So for God to look upon suicide as a sin, as an evil act, does not cancel out in some way the compassion that he also has for the person who is in such a dark place that they find themselves wanting to do that. But we don't really get as much compassion here because the Spectre is not the agent of God's compassion. Anyway, Holt's atheism, certainly front and center. He says, "I don't believe in God," to which the Spectre replies, "And yet I am here. Your belief matters not." And so from an all-seeing perspective of like the writer, I think, if you read actually the new history of the DC universe, God is mentioned. And so for someone in the DC universe to hold a view of atheism, I think we as the readers are meant to see them as incorrect in that view, depending, I suppose, on what they mean by that. I think there's been stories written where Holt kind of like justifies his atheism by describing God as like a supernatural being. He allows for the supernatural, but that's not really in keeping with what atheism truly is. He just kind of seems to go in the direction of, well, I just describe him differently. And I'm like, okay, well, if it's a coherent description, we're not talking about chaotic, nonsensical magic when we talk about God. That's not the concept presented, in the Bible. It's very orderly and reasonable and logical. Anyway, all that to say, it's hard to agree with his atheism, and I think from a writing and editorial standpoint, we're not necessarily supposed to, which I would imagine could alienate some atheist readers who maybe have trouble doing some of the mental gymnastics required to see the DC universe as like naturalistic in its nature. But then again, if you're going to try and make Christianity compatible with the DC universe, you're going to have to do a lot of mental gymnastics in that realm too. Anyway, I just find it interesting here that in the face of him loudly declaring, "I do not believe in God," the Spectre says, yeah, well, it really doesn't matter what you believe. The truth is the truth. But now something the Spectre says more than once in this issue that I don't find reasonable and don't find good grounds for is in response to Michael Holt saying, "I'm insignificant to the universe, a speck of stardust." Well, after the Spectre saying that self-murder is still murder, that seems to uphold the value of human life even when one wants to take their own life. It seems that for that to be true, for that to be a path that is worth avoiding, there must be great significance to every human life. And yet, when Holt says, "I'm insignificant to the universe, a speck of stardust," so just speaking, I'm just matter. I'm just matter like the rest of the universe. All right, sorry, I lost my internet connection, so I can't show the comic anymore. But the Spectre responds by saying, "You are only as insignificant as you believe yourself to be." So flying in the face of any kind of like objective sense of the worth of human life, the Spectre seems to be saying here that we create our own sense of worth. Well, we do create our own sense of our worth, but our senses can be wrong. If he's saying that you objectively are only as insignificant as you believe yourself to be, well, then he's putting forth this concept of relativism, that we literally create our own objective value and meaning and purpose. But that's a contradiction. We can't subjectively create our objective value. So in one sense, the writing here seems to reject a concept of atheism, but does not have like a real objective grounding for virtues, values, purpose, and meaning in the universe. Anyway, I found that interesting. So that's Mr. Terrific, Year 1, Number 2. This week I have chosen the White Ring, not because I'm feeling all the emotions at once, but just really in honor of Kyle Rayner being recognized as still having the White Lantern abilities. Like I said, I really would like to see them go somewhere interesting with that. And I think those are all of my thoughts on comic books for now. As always, love getting your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. You can get this content, if you didn't know, as a monthly audio podcast. christiangeekcentral.com is where you want to go for that, and a bunch of other content made for you there as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.